Bygone Peterborough and the Towns of the Fens is brought to you in association with the Peterborough Evening Telegraph. Welcome to Bygone Peterborough and the Towns of the Fens. My name is Michael Drake, and it's my pleasure to accompany you on our journey through more than half a century of memories from the towns and villages of the Cambridgeshire Fens and the great city of Peterborough itself. The images that we are about to see have been selected from over 500 reels of film taken in the area between the 1920s and the 1970s. Mainly by local cameramen and women, both professional and amateur. It is to the preservation of this film as a social document that this program is dedicated. It is not our intention to record an authoritative history of the area, but rather to present to you a nostalgic portrait of this fascinating city and its neighborhood, as seen through the eyes of filmmakers of the time. In a few cases, the film is accompanied by an original soundtrack, and where possible, this has been included to add to the flavor of the time. Let's take a brief look at a few of the other Fenland towns which feature later. Incidentally, the choral music which accompanies some scenes in this program is from Peterborough Cathedral Choir in the 1960s. Master of the music was Mr. W. Stanley Vann. When war was declared in 1939, the citizens of Peterborough and those of the surrounding Fenland towns were determined to be ready for what was to come. Chemical warfare was not being ruled out. Demonstrations were arranged all over the area for local volunteer defence groups on how to deal with incendiary bombs and such like. Poison gas was thought likely to be a major hazard, and everyone in the country was issued with a gas mask, which had to be carried everywhere. Teams of instructors toured the area, showing people how to correctly adjust their masks. The experience of a simulated gas attack was provided with the aid of specially equipped vehicles. This is a rare colour film of volunteers in Wisbech assembling gas masks from components shipped in tins from central stores. The completed masks are then loaded into apple boxes for distribution throughout the Isle of Ely. Slit trenches like these at the Queen's School were dug to provide some protection against attack from the air. A week of parades and events featuring personnel from all services was held in Peterborough in May 1944. With the aim of boosting morale and generating funds for supplies and equipment just ahead of D-Day. These demonstrations were by the Home Guard. By the 16th of May, it was the turn of the Sea Cadets to help boost funds to well over the £500,000 target in wartime savings bonds. A year later, the uniforms and the marching bands were back on the streets of Peterborough, this time to celebrate victory in Europe. The salute was being taken by Lieutenant Colonel the Marquis of Exeter. A drumhead service was held on Wednesday, the 9th of May 1945, presided over by the Mayor's chaplain, Salvation Army Major Kathleen Hunt. The prayers were led by Brigadier Allen. The people of Helpston lit a huge bonfire, and the young danced around it as the spirit of euphoria spread across the country. The years of nightly blackouts were over. The flags were out and impromptu dancing continued in the streets of the city. Little remains today of the RAF station at Westwood, which was used during the war by No. 7 Flying Training School to train British and Free French pilots, among others, on a variety of aircraft from de Havilland Tiger Moths to North American Harvards. On the 6th of July 1945, Marshal Vallin, Chief of Staff of the French Air Force, was presenting wings and certificates to young graduate airmen who had qualified just too late to see action in World War II. The ceremony was attended by top brass and guests from both sides of the Channel. Football has held a special place in the affections of Peterboroughian sports lovers since well before cinematography was invented. We think it likely that this match, which took place in the early 1930s, was played on the old ground off Fulbridge Road and Tennyson Road. The strip of these opposing teams from 1933 may look very different from that worn by players today, but they were helping to mould a proud tradition in the city which for many saw its culmination in Peterborough United's 1959 FA Cup run. One of the most memorable matches of that series took place at London Road against Shrewsbury Town, in front of a crowd of 16,321 people. We join the match with Peterborough 2-1 down. Emery to McNamee. Across to Rayner for a first-time shot. It's stopped by Humphreys. He's dropped it, and it's a goal from Smith, the inside left, to bring the score to Peterborough 2, Shrewsbury 2. Edgley now to Ireland, the outside right. Into the centre, Starkey takes the ball, and it's another goal for Shrewsbury. With Peterborough now trailing 2-3, sadly their run of victories in this year's FA Cup looks like coming to a premature end. A pass inside now to Emery, who shoots, and it's another goal for Peterborough. Hales now struggling to get past Wallace, hooks it back very tight to Rayner, and he's scored. A tremendous goal there by centre-forward Rayner in the closing minutes of this first-round FA Cup tie, bringing Posh back from a 2-0 deficit to a 4-3 victory over Shrewsbury. The following year, Posh was elected to the Football League. The new town bridge was built in 1934 to replace an earlier iron structure. This was necessary to cope with increasing traffic from an ever-expanding population, even in those days. Peterborough owes its growth and prosperity to a wide variety of different industries, none more so than engineering. One name that has been synonymous with Peterborough for many years is that of Perkins Engines, now Verity Perkins. Frank Perkins' original office was at 17 Queen Street, adjacent to the Queen Street factory. All this was subsequently demolished to make way for the Queensgate shopping centre. These factory gates were locked for the last time in 1976. Perkins diesel engines have been fitted to a wide range of machines and vehicles over the years, and in 1955, these were just some of the state-of-the-art diesel-powered commercial vehicles in use locally. Another major employer in the city since 1904 was Baker Perkins, whose workforce can be seen leaving their Westfield Road factory and offices in the early 1930s. Unconnected with Perkins engines despite the similar name, Baker Perkins were also engineers, making everything from printing presses to laundry equipment to biscuit-making machines. Open days in the 1950s were always well supported. Almost everyone knew someone who worked for Baker Perkins. In 1960, in a city with a population of not much more than a third of that of today, filmmaking was an important part of recruitment drives carried on by many large firms.
8:15 and off to work. Like 3,000 others in Peterborough, he's on his way to Baker Perkins. Westwood Works is the headquarters of the parent company, which has 22 engineering concerns at home and overseas. In all, some 10,000 people are employed. To meet the demand for high-quality products, the various works have been kept at a high pitch of efficiency by the installation of the latest equipment. Men, methods and machines are second to none, and the company enjoys a worldwide reputation.
As Peterborough continued to grow throughout the 1960s and 70s, roads became a priority, and the famous system of parkways began to develop. Other facilities were required to support a rapidly expanding population, and Peterborough District Hospital was built adjacent to the old Memorial Hospital in Thorpe Road. The Sessions House can be seen in the foreground. Homes for the elderly were provided and new schools were built, such as this one at Orton Longville. The principal material for all this development came from here. The lower Oxford clay to the south and east of Peterborough had been used for brickmaking for centuries, and the London Brick Company was obliged to scale up production to cope with the increasing demand. Now included within the conurbation of Peterborough, one small village has given its name to a common brick, which is to be found in buildings from pigsties to palaces throughout the length and breadth of Great Britain. Seen here in the 1970s, Fletton Village is still near to the heart of brickmaking today. Kingsdyke Works near Whittlesea, where a new kiln and brickmaking plant was constructed in the late 60s to keep pace with growing demand. The entire plant is below ground level, except for its chimney, and was built inside one of the many pits from which brick clay has been extracted for many years. It was formally opened by the Right Honourable John Silkin MP, Minister of Public Buildings and Works, on the 24th of June 1969. It's often said that when one door opens, another closes. The Lindens in Peterborough's Lincoln Road was the family home of the Peytons. Filmed here in July 1939 by Lionel Peyton, the house became a military hospital in the following year and was bequeathed to the city in 1950 by Alfred and Emily Peyton. It was from here that Lionel set out in August '39 to film the Great North Road from London to Grantham, and we join the journey at the Brampton Hut Hotel near Huntingdon. The film was made, so the story goes, because Lionel was convinced that following the outbreak of war, life in his England would never be the same again. This war memorial once stood at Norman's Cross. The narrowness of the old Packhorse Bridge at Wansford meant that this was the first village to be bypassed in March of 1929 on what was eventually to become the A1. Unlike many other towns and villages on the route, Stamford in the 1930s is easily recognizable today. In the following series of clips from 5 decades, we take a look back at life in the towns and villages surrounding Peterborough. This was Water Lane and Peterborough Road, Castor, in 1933. When Sir Richard Winfrey, local politician and publisher, celebrated his 74th birthday at Castor House on August 3, 1932, he was clearly determined to demonstrate to his adversaries that he was still a force to be reckoned with. Although the A47 still ran through the village of Eye in 1970, the traffic volumes were very different from those of today. Note the steeple on the church. Wonder what happened to that? Perhaps more popular in the 1950s and 60s than it is today, a fox hunt always seems to draw a crowd. Having taken the stirrup cup at the Haycock, this meet moves out through the village of Wansford. At Warmington this time, this is the Fitzwilliam hunt in the early 1950s. Ever wondered how the people of Yarwell and Nassington celebrated the Silver Jubilee in 1977? Well, these are the regulars from the Angel at Yarwell. And these are the people of Nassington. Do you recognize anybody? I understand that the Max Wall character was the local school headmaster. The town of March was also in celebratory mood in 1977. The agricultural importance of the area was recognized in 1956 when at White Fen Farm in nearby Benwick, the Potato Marketing Board sponsored the first national potato harvester demonstration, featuring machinery not just from Britain, but from all over Europe. Johnson's Engineering, later to be taken over as Ransom, Sims and Jefferies, was an important employer in March and produced machines for potato growers all over the UK. The people of Chatteris were out in force on the 2nd of June 1976 to welcome home boxer Dave Boy Green. That looks remarkably like the then local MP, Clement Freud. Dave was returning with the Lonsdale belt, having won the British Light Welterweight Championship. He later went on to become European welterweight champion and had 2 attempts at the world title. That other cathedral city of the Cambridgeshire Fens, Ely, has not changed greatly since the 1960s. One notable exception being the closure of the British sugar factory, which dominated the west bank of the Great Ouse. Known as the Hospital Parade, this carnival in 1969 was in aid of the Tower Hospital, then in Cambridge Road. Another popular institution to be closed down in 1969 was Stewart and Patterson's Brewery, which was taken over by Watney's and closed its gates for the last time in January of that year. Whilst Ely Cathedral is often referred to as the Ship of the Fens, the people of Wisbech have long been referring to their town as the capital of the Fens. The centre of the town has changed a great deal since the early 1960s, when this amateur film was taken. In 1948, a pageant was staged in the park depicting the history of the town and the changing fortunes of the Fens. At one time, Wisbech had an open-air swimming pool at North End alongside the River Nene, or depending where you live, the Nen. A forerunner of the well-known Rose Parade, which still continues today, was the Strawberry Fair, filmed here in 1964. The slave auction taking place at the foot of the Clarkson Memorial was designed to raise money for repairs to the church tower. I wonder what Thomas Clarkson would have thought. This unusual view of the near-deserted port of Wisbech with the tidal River Nene frozen solid was filmed in the winter of 1962. One familiar and rather colourful character in Peterborough was the late Walter Cornelius. Lithuanian by birth, Walter lived and worked in the city for many years. In addition to his demonstrations of strength and endurance, he was well known for stunts, such as pushing a cannonball through Stamford with his nose and attempting to fly across the River Nene on homemade wings. A great deal of money was raised in this way for local charities. Sadly, Walter died in poverty in 1983.
The cathedral city of Peterborough is actually situated in its own administrative area of the Soak of Peterborough, without and yet part of the county of Northamptonshire. Much of its prosperity is due to agriculture and engineering, and the combination of the two in mechanized farming. Holland is justly famous for its tulip and other bulbs, but these scenes have not, as one may suppose, been taken in the Dutch fields. The fens skirting Peterborough have provided these colorful pictures, and the flower bulb industry has rapidly become an important one, besides attracting thousands of visitors annually to the fens.
That rather idealized view of fenland agriculture was filmed in 1955, and much has changed since then. The 1974 local government reorganisation brought Peterborough into the county of Cambridgeshire. Britain joined the EEC, and bulb growing has declined to some extent, giving way to crops of wheat, potatoes and sugar beet. Life on the large arable farms of the fens has always been hard, with no shelter from the biting east winds in winter and little shade from the sun in summer. Mechanisation did not arrive overnight, particularly on the smaller farms. While in 1963 this gentleman was still ploughing his land at Murrow with the aid of a horse, this farmer was using a helicopter to spray his crops against pests. Sugar beet was once harvested by hand. As were peas in the early 1950s. Fruit picking has always been labour-intensive and has provided seasonal work for generations of holidaymakers and itinerants alike. It is perhaps in the area of grain production that mechanisation has had its greatest impact. Corn was gathered in sheaves by these state-of-the-art reapers and binders, and then collected and stacked in a rick, which was thatched with straw against the weather. Until such time as it could be fed into a threshing machine. The newly threshed grain would then be placed in hundredweight sacks for delivery to the corn merchant. The Harvest Home celebrations were an important part of life in many rural communities. The boss traditionally bought the beer. In the 1940s, this 1,000-acre farm near Crowland employed 48 men and 48 horses. The same farm is now run by just a father and son. Peterboroughians have always been keen competitors with an impressive range of sports available for all. In the 1930s, hockey was the game for well-brought-up young ladies to let off steam. In the 1920s, golf was something to have a go at. Skating has long been a traditional sport in the Fens. With innovation often overcoming inability. The hard winter of 1962-63 provided an ideal opportunity. This film was taken where the Nene ceases to be tidal at the Dog-in-a-Doublet sluice. Horse fishing is another sport for which the Fens have long been justly famous. Dedication like this deserves to be rewarded. Motorsports too have always been popular with local people. In the 1950s, the Peterborough Motor Club was using the old Polbrook Aerodrome to hold its rallies. Ulwarton was the place to go in the early 70s for some of the most exciting speedway anywhere. The 70s was also the time when banger racing first appeared, providing a chance for anyone to have a go without the need for vast financial investment. Regular events took place at Great Gidding, hosted by the late Mushy Drake. Over the years, this part of the world has always been able to boast its share of more light-hearted or slightly offbeat sporting events. This particularly muddy tug-of-war in 1972 was sponsored by the Peterborough Evening Telegraph. How about conkers? Hang on, isn't that a young Eddie Yates? The National Conker Championships have been held at Ashton near Oundle for years. Traditionally employed as a means of getting around in the Fens, dyke jumping enjoyed a revival in the 1960s and 70s as a competitive sport, appreciated by its spectators as much for the ignominious failures of its competitors as for their successes. Up until 1850, the River Nene would have served as the main communication highway for the city of Peterborough. Then along came the Great Northern Railway, providing links with London in the south and the great industrial towns of the north. The GNR built their station, Peterborough North, on the site of the current railway station. Peterborough East Station was on the March Line and was owned by Great Eastern Railways before the days of LNER. The arrival of the railway facilitated not only the free movement of people, but also of goods from factories and produce from the agricultural heartlands in which the city is situated. With the coming of the railway, the population of Peterborough exploded. Having built large and impressive stations, the railway companies went on to build rows of houses for their workers, such as those along Walpole Street and Lincoln Road. Other services were also provided. The Railway Mission Hall was pulled down in the mid-1960s. The GNR School has also been demolished, but some of the houses along Lincoln Road are still occupied today. When it comes to steam locomotives, probably some of the most impressive pulled the great LNER express trains across the Fens to Peterborough in the 1930s. This is the only known pre-war colour film of this line. When Perkins Engines built their 1 millionth engine for export in 1962, they chartered a special train for the day, pulled by an A4 streamliner, to bring guests into Peterborough Station to celebrate the event with a lavish reception at the factory. One of the disadvantages of steam trains, particularly in the summer, was the attendant risk of fire. This was the fate in May 1963 of Black Bridge, which carried the line between Peterborough East Station and Whittlesea across King's Dyke at Stanground. Perhaps the most filmed and photographed of all the famous steam locomotives was the Flying Scotsman, seen here at Crescent Bridge in 1966. Here she is again, across the Fens just outside Ely. At Fletton Bridge in 1960, and at Warrington in the early 1980s for the making of the James Bond film Octopussy on the Nene Valley Railway. No roundup of transport in the area would be complete without reference to the unique little tram which used to run between Upwell and Wisbech along the line of the old Wisbech Canal. As the importance of railway transport declined, so that of road travel increased. Or was it the other way around? This is what Bridge Street in Peterborough looked like in 1964. When Reed's Garage opposite the Kinema in Peterborough's Broadway decided to celebrate Morris Week in the early 1930s, they had a film camera follow them to record the event as they displayed the latest models of the Morris range, probably down Lincoln Road. The Boxing Day meet has always been a special event in the fox hunting calendar. The Fitzwilliam Hunt have been frequent visitors to the city centre over the last 60 years. A few minutes ago, we saw how other towns and villages in the Fens celebrated the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. Just in case you were wondering, this is what Peterborough was up to in 1977. The best known and perhaps the most popular event in the city's social calendar is the East of England Show. This is how it looked in the early 1970s. But well before this, in the 1930s, this modest trade exhibition promoted retail businesses in Peterborough. How many local names can you recognize? Not so long ago, films were a vitally important part of daily life. We know of at least 9 cinemas in Peterborough between the wars. Most people went to the pictures at least once a week. A lot of things have disappeared from our daily lives over the last 70 years. Many others have changed almost beyond recognition. We are indebted to the foresight of a few local cinematographers who've made it possible for us today to revisit places and relive moments that otherwise would have been lost forever. I hope you've enjoyed this brief glance over the shoulder of life at things as they once were in Peterborough and the towns of the Fens. Hopefully, by watching the videos in this series, a few more people will come to realise the importance of local film as a social document. Should you have any old film which you think might be of interest to us for a future production, please contact us. The telephone number appears at the end of the programme. In the meantime, I leave you with the timeless sound of the Peterborough Cathedral Choir, directed by Stanley Vann.